Okay, let's chat about Extemp. So you want to do Extemp, you've already been doing impromptu. Well, truthfully, the events are not super different. The primary difference is the knowledge base for these events is different, right? So Extemp is all about current events, impromptu is all about generalizable knowledge. So there's going to be a lot of overlap between the components of an extemp speech and the components of impromptu. Um, but it's worth just running through the structure real quickly, and then we can expand a bit more on some other parts. So basic extemp structure, very similar to impromptu. Your introduction, three main points, conclusion, right? Your introduction, you can start with an attention grabber. So ideally, some kind of metaphor for the topic area, something that's unique and interesting. Um, so there's quite a bit you can use in terms of attention grabbing ideas. It's also possible to use more of a just straight up attention component where you are doing less of an impromptu style and more just immediately getting into what the topic is and identifying some interesting component of the topic, starting to set up why we care. So pretty straightforward. So when you are introducing the topic, and you should do this regardless of whether or not you use a distinct attention grabber, a couple things you want to do. Two things really. Number one is you need to provide adequate background on the topic. And by background, I mean not argumentation. You're not in the body of the speech yet. You should be instead pretending that the audience has literally never heard of your topic before and giving them the basic information that they need to understand what exactly is going on. So just to give an example relevant to today, let's say your question is something like, can Andy Burnham finally break the cycle of inept prime ministers in the UK? If that's your question, then you need to do a couple things. One, who's Andy Burnham? What political party does he represent? When was he elected into power? Two, the other part of the question is breaking the cycle of inept prime ministers. So you would probably want to talk about the recent history of prime ministers in the UK and why they seem to have been forced to resign left and right. Hint, it started during Brexit, which was about 10 years ago now and has continued ever since. You would want to mention, if not all the names of the previous prime ministers, at least how many there have been that the UK is kind of just churned through. So again, just context useful for understanding the question. However, in addition to the context, you're going to want to provide a significant statement. Basically, the significant statement answers the question, why did you choose this topic? Why did you feel this topic was more worthy of discussion than the other two that you had access to? So when I say, why did you choose the topic, I don't mean that in I know a lot about the topic. It was easier to brainstorm my speech. I don't mean it in that sense. I mean it in what is the significance of this topic? What is so compelling about it? Why should we care? Basically, you're trying to tell the judge, here's why you should listen to me. So you would want to hopefully cite a source. And you should probably cite a source in the background as well. But cite a source that talks about what is the significance of this topic, right? So if I am thinking about this Andy Burnham example, I am probably thinking, this topic is significant because instability at the highest ranks of the United Kingdom perhaps underscores a rising sense of dissatisfaction within the United Kingdom with the status quo, with the way the government runs and works or does not work for people, right? that I think would be a fairly generalizable significance statement. Hopefully the significance doesn't duplicate what you plan to talk about in the main points, but it should ideally convey a sense of like why the question matters. What do we gain by answering the question? So that's how I would approach the top portion, your sort of attention grabbing portion, as well as the topic introduction portion. So now, once you establish the significance, you should pose the question and provide an answer. You state the question verbatim. Very similarly to with impromptu answers, you should have a very firm answer that is unequivocal, meaning it is firmly taking a stance. Do not hedge, do not say maybe it's some of X, maybe it's some of Y. It has to be full-throated. Yes, Andy Burnham can break the cycle and manage to last more than a year or two, or no, he will end up in the same place as his predecessors. One or the other, not somewhere in between. Not, well, it depends on how he does this. And no, none of that. Just yes or no. I think that additionally, a good thesis statement should be a bit more specific. One-word answers yes or no are not compelling. Go beyond that. Say why you think yes or no. And obviously, your main points are going to help you with that, but provide a single sentence that really offers a more substantive look at why you're saying yes. And then we then want to provide a preview, right? Stating your main points. Then we get to the body. Every main point should be, and by the way, the intro for the Extemp speech should be about 1.5 minutes in length. The body, main points should be about 1:45 each if you're doing 3 main points. I think some potential to have them be a little shorter or longer depending on how you're distributing your arguments, although they should be ideally roughly equal in length. So now we have very similar transitions as we do in impromptu, where you are identifying your preview. The first reason Andy Burnham will succeed where his predecessors failed is X. So again, referencing the language of both the question as well as your answer. And then you provide your main points. So in a typical main point, you want to structure the main point as follows. First, you want your sort of like on top information, which is just sort of a short explanation of the reason, like the logic that you're about to introduce. Usually just a sentence or two, often the connection between what the argument is, like the topic sentence in essence, and the thesis is already rather clear, but you should start with some brief explanation. Then you want to go and provide a quick internal preview. So basically, think of it like this. Every main point, you're going to have argument, subpoint, subpoint. Each subpoint has its own piece of evidence. So argument, subpoint, subpoint. I think where a lot of extempers miss the boat on structure is they fail to make it clear what the subpoints are. Instead, it's just argument, vomit, splatter of evidence, and the evidence is not really organized in a cohesive way. It's not clear what each piece of evidence is trying to articulate. So I'll hear a main point with like 3 or 4 sources cited, and I'm like, what are we getting at here? To avoid that, we want to make sure that every point has subpoints underneath it. So I'm going to be honest, I do not know enough about Andy Burnham to give you an actual main point with subpoints off the top of my head. I think that it could potentially, like one argument could potentially be, I don't know, Andy Burnham has a populist streak that his predecessors lacked. And then the first subpoint would be he was the mayor of Manchester, I believe, and developed that populist reputation, which is what propelled him into office in the first place. But then secondarily, he has made certain populist commitments since taking office, which he will follow through on. And then for each of those 2 subpoints, you introduced evidence to support that subpoint. And then you want to follow each piece of evidence with analysis. Because evidence alone in a vacuum is not analysis. You take the evidence that you present and you essentially add your own commentary. So you want to ask yourself questions such as, what does this evidence suggest? What can we conclude from this evidence? Is this evidence strong or weak in favor of the conclusion I'm trying to draw? Think about the relative quality of the evidence. Sometimes if you have a weaker piece of evidence, it's okay to be like, notably this evidence lacks X. You can say that, right? But then explain why you think it's still valid to draw the conclusion. But finally, you want to ask yourself, can the conclusions be applied to the specific argument I'm trying to support? Analytical, 46 sentences, lay it out logically, make sure that it is cleanly tying back to the logic of the main point. And then you do the same for the second piece of evidence. And then you do a quick review at the bottom where you kind of recap the 2 main points, or the 2 subpoints. So you would say Andy Burnham given that Andy Burnham has populist origins and has continued to make populist promises, it is reasonable to infer that his commitment to populism will carry him farther in the office of 10 Downing Street than his predecessors. And you do that 3 times. 3 different main points. One thing we didn't talk about yet is also there should be a conclusion, but that's basically the same as impromptu. Restate the question, restate the answer, restate the preview, go back to your attention grabber. Yippee. Different main point structures. Very important to understand what type of question you've received in order to prepare the correct type of speech. For example, a question of policy is always going to ask, should someone do something? Or should X be done? Sometimes it's written in the passive voice. In those situations, you always want to use more of a persuasive type of structure, meaning a problem cause solution, or cause effect solution, or problem plan solvency. One of the biggest mistakes I see with policy questions is people just try to do a 3 different topical main points structure, and it rarely works out well because they end up missing one of the three components. So you always want to make sure you use some sort of persuasive structure. And in fact, I would argue that if you have a list of questions and one of them is a policy question, pick the policy question because the structure is already done for you. It's just the easiest, as opposed to more of a predictive question where structure can be a bit more open-ended. A predictive question asks you to make a prediction, right? So these can be classified as like akin to resolutions of that in debate, and they are about the future, right? So the Andy Burnham question that I gave you, that is a predictive question. It's not asking whether Andy Burnham is good or bad. It's not asking, will or should he do something. It's just posing the general question: is this guy gonna have any hope of a lengthier tenure in office than his predecessors? Just making a prediction, right? So predictive questions, a couple different structures. You can use a topical structure, right? Here's 3 different reasons this guy's going to stick around. You can use a chronological structure. Chronological refers to time. So you could examine his past history as a politician and use his past history to explain how that will support his ability to persist. You could then look at the present day, look at what he's doing right now in office. And then in the third main point, examine what's this guy going to do in the future that will let him stick around. Which of course is making predictions for a predictive question, but I think that structure is often very intuitive and can work very well. Another type of structure could be a structure where things are ordered in terms of some sort of logical sequence. So for example, I don't know what, I was going to say local, state, national, but the UK doesn't have states, and I forget what their larger subdivisions are called. I may need to look this up for my own sake. I mean, they have England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, but that's not exactly what I'm getting at. Maybe it's just counties. That might be the bigger, yeah, I think it's just counties. So you could look at local level, county level, and then national level. That could be another way to look at it. Like look at what he does in all those areas, and his popularity in all those areas, and then do a little sequential one like that. So that's another way to structure it, right? So same with topics that are more like value-oriented topics, meaning is something good or bad, is something desirable, undesirable. You can often pick one of those types of logical structures. Okay, so we covered extemp structure a little bit. One thing I also want to add on to extemp is to talk a bit about citing sources. Since in extemp you are citing sources, whereas in impromptu you are not. Let's talk about how to do research. Let's talk about how to cite sources. First of all, note that at nationals there's now a rule, there's a ban against using artificial intelligence for extemp prep. Meaning you are not allowed to plug a prompt into ChatGPT or Gemini, and even if you're just saying, oh, well, I'm just using the articles it finds, you're still not allowed to do that. So you have to do things the good old-fashioned organic way. My understanding is that prohibition even extends to, like, when you do a Google search and there's like an AI summary at the top, you can't even use the AI summary. They want you to disable that in the prep room, so that you are forced to rely on your own research. And consequently, it's best to just avoid the general Google search altogether when you're researching a topic. I have a custom Google search which will produce, it is limited to major news websites. So it will only return results from major news websites. It's a little finicky to search with because it has, it's lacks some of the advanced filtering that Google searches do, but I have that available. And then there's also a library database, US major dailies. And I'm going to be showing you how to use that, not during this lecture since it's hard to show it recording. But that is an excellent source because, one, you're not going to have the issue with paywalls that you often have with a straight Google search, and two, all the sources there are going to be up to date, contemporaneous, etc., etc., etc. Okay. In terms of prep, like how to actually do the research, how to actually put together an Extemp speech. So you get 30 minutes. It is undesirable to use all 30 minutes writing out the speech. Extremely undesirable. You want to probably use a maximum of 20 minutes of your 30 minutes researching the speech. Why do you think that is?
So you have time to practice the speech.
So you can practice it, yeah. In fact, the best Extemp speakers can prep in 15 minutes and practice it twice. Difficult, but doable. But I think that for somebody, in a first, second year type situation, I think 20 minutes is a good middle ground. And as a developing extemper, you really have to stick to the 20 minutes. You have to hold yourself accountable. Using all 30 minutes to write the speech is a recipe for getting up there and having stars in your eyes and losing track of what you plan to say because you've never said it before. And the funny thing is, a lot of coaches don't tell their students you need to practice your Extemp speech before you deliver it. And you'll see people hanging out in the prep room for 25 minutes, and then they go up and go to their room and give a mediocre speech, right? So 20 minutes prep maximum gives you enough time to walk to the room. Once you're outside the room, that's when you practice the speech. Go to the room first before you practice, because you don't want to be at like 28 minutes and then start walking to the room and then realize you can't find it. So you've got 30 minutes in total. How should we allocate the 20 minutes prep? The most important thing is to very quickly decide on a topic. You have a list of topics, you need to just choose one. Like I said, I think that policy speeches offer policy questions, offer a pre-built main point structure, and for that reason they can be easier. I think that you can also consider your level of familiarity with the topic. If the topic is about something you've never heard of before, that could be, something that makes it more difficult to research. On the other hand, oftentimes judges, and I count myself among them, judges can see what all the questions are, and if you choose the question that quote unquote looks the hardest because it's the most obscure, like if the question's asking about, I don't know, the most recent elections in Nigeria or something, that's not a question I've ever thought about or read about personally. So I'm going to be very, very impressed if a student chooses that question versus a question about like the United Kingdom or France or some other more well-known country. I think the most important thing once you select a question is to stick with the question. Do not ever get yourself into a position where you're like 5 minutes in and you're like, oh, I don't know how to answer the question. I'm just gonna go and do a different question. Well, you can't do that because then you've wasted 20% or almost 20% of your prep time. You just can't do it. So you need to stick with the question that you choose. Once you've chosen it, even if it feels suboptimal to you, no takesy backsies. After you have chosen the question, stuck to the question, you also need to determine how you plan to answer the question. Ideally, you'll know how to answer the question the moment you pick the question, but sometimes you have to do some reading, right? So do some reading, but not too much reading to determine a good answer to the question. And then you really want to just really just want to stick to an answer and find the main points that support the answer. In terms of research, how many sources do you need? I'd say 7 is the absolute bare bones minimum. You need to cite at least one source in the introduction and at least 2 sources per main point, making for 7 in total. I think there is value in citing 8 or 9 sources, potentially up to 10. I think beyond 10 is too much, and you've probably made some trade-offs in your research. I think at that point, you should have a note card. You should be constructing the outline on the note card, right? Make sure you have a highlighter. Highlight those source citations. Speaking of which, source citations. What information do we need to include with a source citation? The answer is 1, the name of the source publication, like the New York Times or the BBC. Do you need to cite the author name? No. Just the name of the publication and the full date of publication. The day, the month, the year. Sometimes you will cite an article that was published on the same day you were giving this speech. In that case, you may cite that orally, something like the New York Times earlier today wrote. You don't need to say the New York Times on August 6th, 2026, because it's the same day. Or the New York Times yesterday also works if it's published on August 5th. But you want to make sure that you are clearly articulating the date of publication. And that's it. Those are the only 2 things you need. There is one other consideration, and I need to print a poster and get it on the board up here. Let's talk about reporting verbs. Basically, I want you to delete the phrase according to from your vocabulary. Have you heard me talk about this before? Okay, perfect. The phrase according to should be deleted from your vocabulary. Why? Because according to is the most boring way of introducing a source ever. It's so staid. It is just boring. It is dull. I don't know why we do this, except that we just do it because we've always done it, right? Replace the phrase according to with active reporting verbs. Active reporting verbs are when you bring your research to life by saying that it does something, the source specifically. The New York Times argues on August 4th, 2026, that Andy Burnham, blah, 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 right? Argues is a reporting verb. The BBC illuminates. The Washington Post exemplifies. The Los Angeles Times explains. Like I said, I'm going to get a list of reporting verbs and throw it up on the wall here because it is just so important. But the overall thing I'm trying to communicate here is when you introduce sources, introduce them in a way that makes them active, in a way that makes them really stick out and makes you stick out because you're introducing them in a way that is memorable and in a way that is interesting. Okay, any other questions about Extemp?
Mm. So, do you always think that we should choose like the hardest question, or only if you feel like you can make a good?
Not necessarily. I think it's more important to choose harder questions in elimination rounds. When the caliber of competition is higher, it becomes more important to stand out. In prelims, it's less important because typically in prelims, as a judge, the way that I rank Extemp speakers is there are typically 1 to maybe 3 Extemp speakers who are technically proficient. They're doing the basics pretty well at a decent level. And then there's usually somewhere between 2 to 3, maybe more, speakers who are not technically proficient. They are not using the full time. They're not citing sources or citing sources correctly. They are, not really answering the question. They're just answering what they thought the question was, right? So they're often like a lot of speakers who just do not have the technical aspects of it nailed down. Once you get to elimination round, that latter group has been knocked out. They go away. Everybody in elims is going to be technically proficient. So at that point, it becomes important to stand out, and choosing a harder question can pay off there.
What are some examples of like good attention getters for Extemp?
Some examples. Well, let's take this Andy Burnham one. Because it's Andy Burnham, this is relevant to the United Kingdom. I want to pick an attention grabber that is relevant to the United Kingdom. So the first place my mind wanders off to is Ted Lasso. Just because it just came back on Apple TV, and I haven't watched the new season yet, so don't spoil. But I could say in the hit Apple TV show Ted Lasso, an American football coach gets called over to the United Kingdom, and specifically to coach the EPL team Richmond United, and Ted Lasso was destined to fail from the start. He was brought into a situation where the team was barely running, had players that didn't fit well together. The owners, and I should say the ex-owners, were embroiled in a divorce dispute, and it was against all odds that Ted Lasso managed to bring this ragtag team to the very apex of English soccer. And surprisingly, the politics in the United Kingdom look a lot like Richmond United right now, characterized by bitter fighting between Labour and Conservatives, with upstart factions like the far right emerging as well. There's just been complete instability within British politics ever since Brexit. And now I've gone from attention grabber to my more substantive overview of the Labour turnover.
Okay.
And my argument, it could be Andy Burnham is Ted Lasso, basically. So that would be an example, right? Does Ted Lasso have anything really to do with British politics? No, but I was able to make the connection.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions?